Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, again, I'm not sure how much you may have come across in your reading, but Khadijah began as Muhammad's boss. So Khadijah was someone who had been twice widowed. She had some money from her previous husbands, and she wanted to invest in a trade that many people in Mecca were invested in to make money, which is to take whatever money you have, go south to the port in Yemen, buy the very light and easily but very costly goods coming off the ships, like perfumes and silks coming from, and spices coming from India and further east, and then carry them overland up into the major cities of the Byzantine Empire, and to sell them, of course, for a high price. And so many people got wealthy in Mecca doing this, and Khadijah wanted to participate in this, but as a woman by herself, she couldn't exactly do this in this insecure situation. So she hires Muhammad to be her representative, to take her money, to go buy the goods, to bring them to Damascus and to sell them. And she's 15 years older than Muhammad, according to the tradition. But they became very fond of one another. They developed a very good relationship. And it's said that when Khadijah was 40 and Muhammad was 25, ages are kind of estimates for sure, but when she's around 40 and Muhammad's around 25, she proposes marriage to Muhammad, and he accepts. And Muhammad and Khadijah have by all accounts, a very happy and mutually supportive relationship. Muhammad is married to Khadijah from the time when they're married, when he's 25, until he's 53, 51 or 52, in his early 50s, when she dies, right? She passes away. And so for that entire time while Khadijah was alive, he took no other wives. And those were his years, right? His sort of prime years, right? 25 to 53. And he took no other wives after Khadijah. With Khadijah, he had a number of children, probably two sons, but neither of them survived past very young childhood, maybe toddler age, between 2 and 4. And then he had 4 daughters, again, to whom he was very close. But Khadijah plays a very important role, not only in providing him with daughters, providing him with support, but also providing him with support when he first starts to receive the revelations. Remember, they've already been married quite a long time at that point. But when Muhammad receives the first revelations, when he is in a cave in the mountains outside of Mecca, he's terrified. And the tradition is quite clear. He's not exactly sure what's happening to him. He's not entirely sure that he hasn't been somehow possessed by jinn, right? The word in Arabic to be possessed by jinn is majnoon. And it's also the word that can be used to mean, crazy, sort of losing your sanity. So he wasn't entirely sure about what this all meant. And he came running down the mountain. Came back, and Khadijah saw that he was very upset, and he says, I don't know, maybe I'm possessed by the jinn, I don't know. And she says, no, I know this isn't the case. I know you're a good person, there's nothing wrong with you, I don't know what this is, but I know that this isn't something bad. And as I mentioned last night, she says, I'm going to take you to my cousin, Waraka, who's a Christian. And she takes him to her cousin, and the cousin again reassures Muhammad. So I say, in many ways, Khadijah was the first believer. She believed even before Muhammad did. Muhammad was in doubt, and she was like, no, I know that this is the case. I'm sorry, did you have a question? Okay. And again, there was a period of time, even after this revelation, there's a long period of time Muhammad didn't hear anything else. Can you imagine sort of having this kind of revelatory experience and then silence, right? He was confused. Is God angry with me? Did I not do what I was supposed to do? Again, she's the person who's constantly supporting him throughout. And even though he married other wives, as I'll talk about in a minute, Khadijah was always on his mind, and maybe also through his very close relationships with his daughters, who were her daughters as well. So after Khadija dies, Muhammad does go on to marry quite a number of women, right? At the time of his death, he has 9 wives to whom he's married, and he had married a couple others as well in the meantime, who died or whose the marriage broke apart before it was fully consummated. So one of the other wives, important wives that he marries very shortly after Khadija, and maybe I should put the names up, is Aisha. So you have Khadija, right, who was older than Muhammad. Not only older than Muhammad, she was likely the same age or even a little bit older than Muhammad's own mother would have been, right? Considering she probably married quite young. So after that, he marries Aisha. And Aisha is kind of the opposite. Aisha, by contrast, is extremely young. So when the marriage is arranged, the engagement is arranged, Aisha is only about 5 or 6 years old, and she's the daughter of his very good friend and supporter, Abu Bakr. The marriage officially takes place and is consummated when she is, again, only 9. So it's almost like 2 opposite extremes. Okay? At the same time, shortly before he marries Aisha, he marries another woman named Sauda, who was either the same age as Muhammad or maybe even slightly older. Sauda? Yeah. So, Aisha, well, if Khadija is presented as being very strong, very supportive to Muhammad, perhaps kind of a motherly figure in some ways as well, Aisha is very much the young girl that she is. And the tradition represents her as being extremely, despite being very young, outspoken, feisty, strong-willed, and the Islamic tradition almost seems to delight in recording accounts of her, her sort of sassiness, you might say, today, sometimes even in relation to Muhammad. So, for example, some of the traditions that it tells us, it says that when Aisha was, when she was happy with the Prophet Muhammad, and she was talking about something, she would say, "Oh, by the Lord of Muhammad, such and such. By the Lord of Muhammad, such and such." But when she was angry or unhappy with him, she would change and she would say, "By the Lord of Abraham." Right? And it was her kind of little way of doing that. She is nonetheless said to have been very deeply loved by Muhammad. She's sometimes referred to as Muhammad's beloved. Certainly after Khadija, she seems to have been the wife that was closest to him. And they had a very strong relationship. At one point, she is falsely accused of having a kind of romantic dalliance with someone else. It's kind of a long story, but she's with Muhammad on a campaign and she accidentally gets kind of left behind. She leaves the caravan and she gets left behind, and she kind of, again, she's probably 11 years old. And she's like, well, I'm just going to sit here and wait till someone comes and finds me. I'm sure they'll come back for me. And sure enough, one of the men from Muhammad's community who had fallen behind comes and finds her and brings her back. And then rumors started about, gee, what happened on the way back, kind of thing. So Muhammad doesn't really believe the rumors, but it kind of bothers him for a while because it's circulating in the community. And finally, a Quranic verse comes down exonerating Aisha and actually castigating people who would spread such vicious rumors. And when Muhammad tells her the news, he comes in and he says, Aisha, good news. This Quranic verse came, everything's cleared up. And she's still mad. She's mad that he didn't, sort of immediately just, castigate the rumors. And she said, I have God to thank for that, not you, So she had that kind of quality in herself. As we'll see, after Muhammad's death, she continues to play a very important role in the development of the traditions that tell us about Muhammad's life, because she had this very close relationship with him. She relates a lot of very intimate details about their home life together, their domestic life together, that become an important part of the tradition, in addition to other material as well. Yes?
Are these ages like estimates, or it's like pretty known that this story you're telling us is he's 55 and she's 11?
Yes.
Like that is
she's definitely young.
Even understand in terms of like an 11-year-old having a conversation with a 55-year-old about anything like this is just like really.
I know. I have an 11-year-old daughter, so sometimes when I think about this, it's so hard for me to understand. But you also have to understand that the time period was quite a different period, right? So, today, an 11-year-old is, a 5th grader or a 6th grader. But there wasn't any school. I mean, sort of women in this kind of a situation, as soon as women, sort of reached puberty, the idea would be to have them, get married, because children died in infancy, and, it was a very, fragile kind of existence. So there doesn't seem to have been any real. I mean, this seemed to have been a norm at the time. So, for example, Muhammad later marries another woman named Hafsa, who's older than Aisha, but not by very much, and she had been married before. So she was probably also married, in her early teens, maybe 11 or 12. So this seems to have been a custom at the time, that once a girl actually reached puberty, was able to bear children, there would have been a kind of incentive to have them start bearing children right away.
To consummate a marriage, and if it was arranged, they would wait for puberty.
But her youth is emphasized in a lot of ways, and ages are estimates because people didn't really mark birthdays, so clearly, but puberty would have been just a clear marker, right? And so some traditions said, well, maybe she was 9 when she got engaged and 13. But she was definitely young, right? I mean, there are traditions that say, she would be sitting there playing with her dolls, and Muhammad would invite her friends over, and they would, he would let them play. He sort of, the tradition presents him as letting her have this kind of childhood at the same time. But again, she, you would think that an 11-year-old girl and a 55-year-old man that she would have, be very intimidated by him. And the tradition really just, for whatever you think of the veracity of the traditions themselves, the traditions clearly enjoy telling these stories. And Aisha tells them herself, right? I mean, that's the other thing. Aisha became such an important source of information about the Prophet's life that she could, present this image of Muhammad and of their relationship that really becomes well-grounded in the tradition itself. Okay, so he does marry other women. As I said, there were 9 women at the time of his death. But again, they were a wide variety of women. So he married some, other than Aisha. Aisha was the only woman that he married who had not been married before. Every other woman he married had been married before. Right? This tradition develops in Islam, you really should marry virgins. Okay, but the prophetic example is not that, right? The prophetic example is that he married many women, and I was talking about this with Kira last night, that he married a wide range. He married women who were older than him, he married women who were younger than him, he married women who were the same age, he married women who were divorced, he married women who were widowed, he married women who came from his own tribe, he married one woman who was Jewish and who had converted to Islam. So there was a wide range, and in that sense, because Muhammad's practice, his sunnah, became so important as a model for the later community, all kinds of marriage possibilities now opened up. right? You couldn't really say it's not, you shouldn't marry a woman who's older or younger or divorced or widowed, because of course there's all these examples of Muhammad doing exactly that. Okay, despite the fact that he married all these other women, right, as I said, 9 at the time of his death, after Khadijah, he doesn't have children with any of them. Right? So he does not have children with any of those additional wives. And that also becomes important in the Islamic tradition, that although, of course, having children is important in any culture and in any tradition, you also have the example of marriage for the sake of the relationship between those two people, which the Quran also endorses, not simply for procreation. Right? One of the wives that Muhammad loved the most, Aisha, had no children with him. And so again, these are sort of important things to bear in mind. The tradition holds the wives of the Prophet in very high regard. They are given the title, each wife of the Prophet is given the title Mu'minin, which means the mother of the believers, which is a title of honor, of course, but it's also related to the fact that unlike all other women in the Muslim community, the wives of the Prophet were not supposed to remarry after his death. They were the mother of the believers. They weren't supposed to be their wives. That is not true for other women, as we'll see in the Islamic tradition. Remarriage after either being divorced or widowed is highly encouraged for both men and women in the Islamic tradition, but the wives of the Prophet were held in this very special kind of position, right, where they weren't supposed to remarry after his death. Okay, the tradition also talks a lot about the way in which Muhammad treated his wives, which many of his contemporaries felt, given the culture at the time, was overly indulgent and overly gave them too much freedom and independence. Again, when I say Islamic tradition, I'm talking largely about the hadith and other material related to that I'll talk more about tomorrow. But the tradition, again, is clear that Muhammad never hit his wives, never raised a hand or even his voice to them. He didn't yell. And there are also traditions saying that there were times when he consulted them in very important affairs, right? And the advice that they gave to him, which became very crucial, again, is recorded in the tradition. So as I'm saying, there is a lot of material, especially when we look at Muhammad's life, to draw upon looking at the situation of women in Islam.